All right, pre-AP biology. This is our first of three lecture videos, finishing up our ecology unit, which is unit two. Um, and these three lectures are over a topic called biogeochemical cycles. So we've been talking a lot about, the environment and different habitats and ecosystems, and we've been kind of talking a lot about a lot of the biotic components, of ecosystems like populations and symbiosis and all that type of stuff. And in this last component of, or this last part of the unit, we're going to kind of focus on how matter cycles itself through um, an ecosystem or through a habitat. So just kind of want to break this term down for you here at the beginning. This term biogeochemical, it's kind of a big, kind of scary vocab term, but just kind of look at different prefixes and suffixes. For example, like bio, right? We know that means life. Geo means that it comes from the earth, like rocks and things like that. And then we have chemical, which refers to chemicals, like our chemistry. So for each one of the cycles that we talk about, like today, for example, we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle. There's a biological component to the nitrogen cycle. So there's a living component. There's sort of an earth component to the cycle as well. And there's also a chemical component to the cycle. So we're going to study the carbon cycle and the water cycle as well. And they're all the same thing. They're all biogeochemical. So you'll kind of see that as we go through the cycle. All right. So kind of start off here, with nitrogen. In my opinion, this is the most difficult of the cycles to understand, just because of the terminology and the vocabulary and the chemistry that's involved with it. So I'm going to kind of make this as easy as I can for you. You may need to watch this video more than once for this stuff kind of to sink in. But anyway, nitrogen is like a super important element to living things. It's the most abundant element that's in our atmosphere. I mean, like 78% of our atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. So, um, because there's so much nitrogen in the atmosphere, we consider it to be what we call a sink of nitrogen. A sink is just an area where a certain element like nitrogen is stored in great amounts. So most of the nitrogen that's on our planet is actually just up in the air. In fact, every time you take a breath, you breathe in a whole bunch of nitrogen gas. Okay, so this stuff, there's tons of this stuff up in our atmosphere. N2, that's nitrogen gas. That's a nitrogen molecule. Now, nitrogen, because it's so abundant, it is something that is needed by living things in great amounts. I mean, animals, plants, everything needs it. In fact, we call that a macronutrient. Macronutrients are just things that like living things need, like in great abundance. In fact, nitrogen, one of the biggest reasons why we need it is because it's a major component of proteins. Like when our cells are making proteins, like for example, your blood cells. Your blood cells make a protein called hemoglobin. We've talked about that one before. If you don't have nitrogen, then your blood cells can't make that protein. Okay, so like we have to have nitrogen. It's a really important thing. Not only animals but also plants. In fact, for plants, nitrogen is so important that if they don't have it, they can't grow. So we consider that to be what we call a limiting nutrient, and that mainly is a term that we use to describe some type of a molecule or some type of an element that's needed by plants. So again, it's if they don't have that, their growth is limited. So we kind of call that a limiting nutrient. So the more nitrogen plants have, the better they'll grow. All right, the less nitrogen they have, the least or the less they're going to grow. So again, nitrogen super duper important. Now, there's one major problem with nitrogen, okay, and this is really the whole reason why we have the cycle. So for all that nitrogen that's in the air, um, it's not usable by living things. So, like I said earlier, every time you take a breath and you breathe in a whole bunch of this atmospheric nitrogen, our body can't use it. It's not a usable form of nitrogen for living things. So as soon as we breathe it in, we just breathe it back out again. All right. So like, this form of nitrogen, for animals and plants both, it just is kind of an unusable thing. But we have to have nitrogen. So we've got to figure out a way that we can get nitrogen because we're not getting it through breathing it in. Okay. All right. So this is where the nitrogen cycle comes into play. Now, as I go through this with you in class, you have a fill-in sheet, a fill-in note sheet. I'm going to highly suggest that um, draw a couple things, write some notes down on this diagram that I'm about to show you, because again, there's a lot of vocabulary and there's a lot of components that are sort of linked to each other, and you may want to kind of fill that in as we go through this. All right, so we're gonna start off in the atmosphere, right? We've got all this nitrogen up in our air, like 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. But again, the problem is this stuff is unusable by living things. So here we have plants and we have animals that need that nitrogen gas, but again, it's not usable. Now, in order for it to become usable, there are bacteria that live in the soil. And you'll notice that these bacteria kind of have an interesting name. They're called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And they live near the roots of a lot of different types of plants. And we'll talk about what those plants are in a couple of minutes. But I mean, these bacteria, they do something that is actually really, really important. They take all of this nitrogen that's in the air and they fix it, or they convert it into something else, which is really important because that's kind of like the first step of the cycle, is to take this unusable nitrogen and make it into a more usable form. Now, we have a special name for this substance that um, that gets converted, or that nitrogen in the air gets converted into. It's called ammonia. Ammonia, the chemical formula for it is NH3. Over here, this is called NH4 plus. This is called an ammonium ion. They're essentially similar things. I mean, chemistry wise, they're a little different, but don't worry so much about that. All you have to understand is that these bacteria that live in the soil, they're taking all of this nitrogen in the air and they're converting it into this ammonia. Okay, and that's kind of a critical thing. Now, this process, we have a name for it. It's called nitrogen fixation. More specifically, we call it biotic nitrogen fixation. Biotic because there's a living thing, a living organism that's doing this for us. All right. So, again, nitrogen fixation is when the nitrogen in the air is fixed or converted into ammonia. So, this is kind of a critical step. Now, the thing about ammonia is still not really usable by living things. It's kind of it's a little bit more usable, but it's not quite ready to be absorbed by living things. So there's another step here. This is called nitrification. And you'll notice that there's some more bacteria that are involved. These are called nitrifying bacteria. They're a different species of bacteria than what we have up over here. But what these bacteria are doing is they're taking this ammonia, and through a two-step process, they're converting it into something called nitrates. Now, I put a purple box around nitrates because that's really important. Also, you will need to identify this formula here, NO3 with a negative charge. That's a nitrate ion, okay? This is a usable form of nitrogen for living things. So I want you to think right now, before we go on, how we even got to this step, right? We've got these bacteria over here, these nitrogen fixers, right? They're taking nitrogen out of the air, converting it into ammonia. And then there are two other species of bacteria. We just call them nitrifying bacteria, but they're actually two different types. But they take that ammonia and they convert it into nitrates. Okay, so this again is a usable form of nitrogen. Now, there's a couple of other ways that nitrates can get into the soil. One way is through lightning. Every time lightning strikes in the atmosphere, it actually has enough energy to convert nitrogen in the air into nitrates. So that's one way that it can get into the soil. But this is kind of an unpredictable thing; like it doesn't happen all the time. So this first pathway over here that we talked about earlier, this is a much more consistent process and a much more reliable process than lightning is. This is nitrogen fixation, but it's called abiotic because it's not being done by a living thing. Whereas over here, this is biotic nitrogen fixation. Now, there's even a third way that nitrates can get into the soil, and that's through synthetic fertilizers. For example, like when farmers put fertilizers on their crops, those chemicals actually have nitrates in them, or they have ammonia in them that will get converted into nitrates. So again, there's kind of three different ways that nitrates get into the soil, and I do want you to know all three ways. I want you to know the biotic way, that's kind of like the natural way, the abiotic way, and also sort of the synthetic way, kind of these synthetic fertilizers that get laid down. But regardless, these nitrates build up in the soil, and then they can be absorbed by plants, and then animals eat those plants. Right? We call that assimilation. Assimilation is just when plants absorb the nitrates. So that's how plants get their nitrogen. They can use it to grow. And then when animals eat plants, or they eat other animals that eat plants, that's how we get our nitrogen. We don't get our nitrogen by breathing it in. We get nitrogen by consuming other organisms that have nitrogen in their tissues. Okay. Now, eventually, these plants and animals are going to die, so they get decomposed, right? They get broken down, and during that process of decomposition, they get basically converted back into ammonia. We call that ammonification. Ammonification happens when decomposing bacteria, another type of bacteria, just breaks down dead plants and animals, and it kind of recharges the cycle down here. So, there's actually two different ways that we can get ammonia into the soil. And one way is through nitrogen fixation, and the other way is through decomposition. All right. So, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but really there's one final thing that has to happen. All this nitrogen that's being pulled out of the air, that nitrogen has to be put back into the air. So we have another type of bacteria. They're called denitrifying bacteria. Their job is they'll take some of these nitrates and they'll convert them back into atmospheric nitrogen. So the nitrogen that's in our air always kind of stays at a constant level because as it's being pulled out, it's also being put back in at the backside of the cycle. All right. Now, your job, because this is a big process, you have to study this diagram. You have to study the steps, you have to study the terminology, you need to identify the chemistry, all the formulas, you have to know the terms. So that's going to be your job, all right? Because this week we do have a quiz, and on that quiz, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about the nitrogen cycle. So here's kind of a summary of the cycle. Just kind of going step by step. Again, you need to know what the name of the step is and kind of what's happening during that step. All right, so for example, biotic nitrogen fixation, there are bacteria involved in that process, and they're converting atmospheric nitrogen into our ammonia. Okay, that's what's happening in that first step. Nitrification, again, there's bacteria involved in that step. They're taking the ammonia and they're converting it into nitrates. All right, you need to be able to identify what this formula is and what it's called. Okay. Abiotic nitrogen fixation. This is done by lightning, right? This is where the nitrogen in the air is converted into nitrates. So that's another way nitrates can get into the soil. Assimilation, that's when plants bring in nitrogen. They absorb it through the soil, And of course, animals get their nitrogen as well by eating plants. Ammonification. Ammonification is when bacteria break down plants and animals, into ammonia. And then, of course, we have denitrification, and this is where the nitrogen goes back up into the atmosphere, um, by denitrifying bacteria. So, lots of stuff going on. You'll notice that there's bacteria involved pretty much in every step of this process. So, again, understanding terminologies, understanding vocabulary, that's really, really important. All right, another term here called a legume. Legume, this kind of goes back to the first step of the nitrogen cycle. Legumes are basically plants that store these nitrogen fixing bacteria. These types of plants, here's some examples of them. Probably one of the most notorious legume plants is soybeans. In the roots of soybeans, they have these little nodules that you see in this picture. And they're tiny little things. They're not very big. They're kind of microscopic. They're less than a millimeter in diameter, so they're really tiny. But on the inside of this nodule are thousands and thousands of little nitrogen fixing bacteria. And they're doing the same thing that we talked about in this first step. They're all just converting that nitrogen in the air into ammonia. So let's say, like, for example, a farmer that grows soybeans. He'll grow his crops and then he'll harvest them. But those soybeans, as they were growing, they were actually putting a whole bunch of nitrogen into the soil. And then let's say, for example, the next season he might grow corn. Now, corn is not a legume, but corn does need nitrogen. So, if he had soybeans in the soil, let's say the season before, that soil should be extremely rich with nitrogen to the point where he probably doesn't even need to fertilize his crops because there's so much nitrogen in the soil already. So, these legumes, these are really important plants for agriculture. They're really important to farmers. Besides the fact that they produce food, they're really good, for soil ecology and to helping other plants grow. All right, human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. Now, one of the biggest things, as far as humans go, that we've done to kind of impact the nitrogen cycle is something called the Haber process. And I don't talk too much about individual scientists, but this guy here, his name is Fritz Haber. Um, he's kind of an important guy, and I'll explain more about him in a few minutes. But Fritz Haber, he was a scientist back in the early 1900s, and he wanted to see if there was a way that we can generate synthetic ammonia. Instead of waiting, for example, for plants to produce it, which is kind of time consuming, is there a way that we can produce ammonia in a lab much more quickly? And to make a long story short, Fritz Haber figured this out. He figured out that there's a commercial way, kind of an industrial way, that we can produce ammonia just by combining nitrogen gas with hydrogen. Now, this kind of sounds easy, but actually it's kind of a difficult process. But he figured out that we can actually get this done. Now, what this led to was the industrial production, like on a massive scale, ammonia, which is the main ingredient in fertilizers. So essentially, his contribution to science, which is a pretty important one, is that he's responsible for today being able to grow a heck of a lot more crops a lot faster. In fact, without synthetic fertilizer, we would only be able to feed about 4 billion people on the planet. And I think I talked about this before, but right now we've got about 7.8 billion people. So there would be no way that we could feed all of these people if we didn't have synthetic ammonia or synthetic fertilizers. So that was a pretty important contribution that Fritz Haber provided to the scientific community. Now, I guess you can kind of look at this one of two ways, right? You can look at it as, okay, thanks Fritz Haber, because now we can feed everybody. But you can also look at it as, Thanks a lot, Fritz Haber, because now that we can feed everybody, there's been a population explosion. People are living longer, they have more access to food. So this has been what we call a detonator for the population explosion on our planet. We went in about 120 years. We went from 1.5 billion people to 7.8 billion people today. And one of the biggest reasons why the population got to that point is because of the contribution of synthetic fertilizers. So you can kind of look at it one of two ways. It's like a good thing that we can feed people, but is it a good thing that we can feed everybody because now we've got all these people, right? So remember we talked about limiting factors? I mean, food is a limiting factor. So if you provide more food for a population, the population is going to increase, and that's exactly what's happened to the human population. Now, another big problem with all of this synthetic fertilizer is all the fertilizers that farmers lay down and that's used in agriculture, whatever. Only about 50% of it actually gets absorbed by plants. The rest of it just ends up running off the land, into groundwater and into rivers and lakes and things like that. Now that brings up an entirely different problem. It's called eutrophication. I want you to look at this picture on the bottom left here. This pond or this small lake, and you see all that green that's kind of floating on the surface. What you're seeing there is basically plants. Those are algae, which are little microscopic plants. But the reason why we have all that algae is because anytime excess nutrients like ammonia or nitrates, if those things get into water, then those plants have what they need to grow, right? So we call this an algae bloom. When all that limiting nutrient is put into the environment, then the plant life just goes crazy, right? You get all this algae that starts blooming and just kind of overgrowing in the water. Now, there's a kind of a big problem with that because even though algae are plants, right, they photosynthesize. Um, Whenever that algae overpopulates and when it grows, eventually it's going to die. All those plants are eventually going to die. And when they do die, they get decomposed. Now, the process of decomposition, like those decomposing bacteria, they actually use oxygen when they decompose. So the more algae you have, the more decomposition you're going to have, and the more oxygen is going to be used in the water. So if all that oxygen is being used up, think about what that's going to do to fish, right? Fish need oxygen. They are animals. So it's not going to be, too much longer, after you see these algae blooms, that you're going to see a bunch of dead fish because all that decomposition strips the lake of oxygen and you're going to get what we call a hypoxic dead zone. A dead zone is basically a body of water that's been stripped of its oxygen, due to too many plants being in the water and eventually all that decomposition that takes place. The final thing here I want to show you, this is a map of the Gulf of Mexico down by Louisiana. And if you're familiar with Louisiana, there is a very large river that drains into the Gulf of Mexico, through New Orleans and through the state of Louisiana. That's called the Mississippi River. And think about where the Mississippi River kind of originates. It originates up in Minnesota, and it travels all the way through the Midwestern part of our country, through all that farmland. Think about all the rivers that flow into it, and think about all the fertilizers and all the nitrates and ammonia that are carried and drain out into this Gulf. There is a 5,000 square mile dead zone that has accumulated in the Gulf of Mexico, all because of the fertilizers that gets drained, or that empties out into this area. So this area here, this key is kind of showing us the red colors. That's where there's basically no oxygen in the water. So I mean, good luck if you're a fisherman, right? trying to catch fish in these red areas because there probably isn't very many. This has actually taken a really big toll on the fishing industry down in New Orleans because there's just not as many fish as there used to be because of the hypoxia that's in the water. So I want you to understand what this is and kind of what causes it. That's a big human impact, on the environment. All right, folks, that's it for me today. Again, watch this again if you need to. I will see you soon.